They called her a fool. They laughed in her face. They told her to put those babies back where she found them and mind her own business. But Maricel did not listen. And what happened next is the kind of story that will stay with you long after this video ends. Because somewhere across that city, one of the most powerful men on the continent was destroying everything in his path, trying to find those same two children. And when he finally did, every single person who had laughed at Maricel went completely silent. Stay with me. This is their story. If you believe that what is done in the dark always comes to light, subscribe right now and turn on that bell. You are going to want to see how this ends. Maricel was 28 years old, and she had never in her life owned anything that could not fit inside one bag. She washed and ironed clothes for other people's families, 5 houses, 6 days a week, moving from one to the next on foot, because transport money was money she did not have. By the time she was walking home past midnight on that particular Wednesday, her hands were raw. Her back had the kind of permanent ache that stops being a complaint and becomes simply a condition, and the $47 she had to her name were already allocated. 31 for rent, 9 for food, 7 she owed the shop owner 2 streets down who had started looking at her differently when she came in. She was not unhappy. That is important to say. She was tired and she was poor, and she had learned, the way people learn things they did not choose to learn, to build a life inside those limits and find the small dignities available within them. She was cutting through the back alley behind the Sule compound when she heard it. Small, thin, the sound of something that had been crying for a long time and was losing the energy to continue. She stopped walking. She stood still. She listened. She crouched down beside a broken crate and pushed it slightly to the side. 2 newborn baby boys, twins, wrapped in a piece of cloth so fine and smooth she had never felt anything like it. One had stopped crying and was simply staring up at her with enormous dark eyes that held, somehow, no accusation, only the extraordinary trust of a creature that has not yet learned that the world is sometimes not trustworthy. The other was still crying, fists clenched tight, furious at whatever had been decided for him without his consent. Maricel crouched in that alley, and she did not immediately reach for them. She looked at them. She did the arithmetic, the fast, brutal, automatic arithmetic of someone who has been poor long enough to calculate the cost of everything, including compassion. Formula, clinic visits, the rent that was already late, the $47, the shop owner's face. She looked at all of that. She looked at it honestly. Then the one who had stopped crying reached upward, just up, toward nothing specific, the way newborns reach, toward whatever warmth the world might still be willing to offer. Maricel picked them both up, wrapped them inside her own jacket against her chest, and walked the rest of the way home in the rain. She told herself it was only until morning. She would go to the authorities at first light and hand them over and return to her life. She believed that completely. She meant it entirely. She told herself that, and she believed it, and she went home. Now, before we go any further with Maricel, because her story is going to ask a great deal of you and it deserves to be told fully, we need to understand how those 2 babies came to be in that alley. And to do that, we need to step inside a very different world. Dominic Reyes was 41 years old and the name on the door of one of the largest business empires in West Africa. His grandfather had built the first private shipping yard in the region. His father had turned it into a conglomerate. Dominic had turned the conglomerate into something that appeared in international financial papers and made governments return his calls. He was the kind of man whose arrival changed the temperature of a room, not through performance, but through the particular stillness of someone who has never needed to prove anything to anyone in a very long time. He had been married once. Her name was Addo, and she was warm and direct and laughed easily, and she had died 6 weeks after giving birth to twin boys, a complication that the best medical team money could reach had not been able to stop. Dominic had sat at her bedside through it and held her hand and said the things that needed to be said, and then he had stood up and walked out of that hospital room and taken his sons home and decided, in the quiet and absolute way he decided things, that he was going to raise them and he was going to be present and he was going to do it right. The boys were named Marco and Matteo. They were 6 weeks old, premature, small, requiring the kind of constant attention that restructures every hour of every day. Dominic had not slept more than 4 continuous hours since they were born. He had photographs of them in his phone case, between the case and the back of the phone where they could not fall out. He checked on them by video call every time he was away from the house, which was not often, because he did not want to be away. But then came the Singapore deal. A port infrastructure acquisition worth hundreds of millions, years in the making, requiring his physical presence for 72 hours. 72 hours. He would be back before the weekend. He left the boys with Celeste. Celeste Vega had been in Dominic's life for 2 years. She was composed and intelligent and had waited through his grief with patience that appeared, from the outside, to be love. Dominic trusted her. He trusted her the way a man trusts someone he has chosen after loss. Carefully, completely, having decided that the trust was worth extending. What Dominic did not know, what no one around him knew, was that Celeste had been running a very quiet internal calculation for several months. Not cruel in the way that people imagine cruelty. She had not sat down one day and decided to be a villain. It had come the way the worst decisions come. Gradually, through accumulated resentment and fear and rationalization, each small thought making the next one slightly easier, until she had arrived, without fully noticing the journey, at a place she could not have imagined when she started. The babies frightened her. Not physically. They frightened her in the way that permanent things frighten people who have been promised something and are watching it become something else. Every bottle she made in the night was a reminder that these two small people would be in Dominic's life forever. Every time he called from Singapore and asked how they were, not how she was, how they were, the thing she was afraid of became slightly more solid and slightly more certain. She did not decide to abandon them the way someone decides to commit a crime. She decided the way people make the worst choices of their lives, one small rationalization at a time, until the thought that had been unthinkable became, in the small hours of a Wednesday morning, something that felt almost logical. She drove to the Sewell compound at midnight. She removed the silk blanket that had been wrapped around the boys. It had the Reyes family crest embroidered in gold thread, and she was afraid it would identify them too quickly. She placed it in her bag. She left them under the crate. She drove back to the penthouse. She poured a drink. She sat down. She told herself the compound security guard would find them within the hour. She told herself they would be fine. She told herself a great many things. Her hand, she noticed, was not entirely steady when she picked up the glass. She called Dominic and left a voicemail in a voice she had rehearsed. Something happened with the caretaker. Call me when you land. It is urgent. Then she sat in the dark, and in the silence of that penthouse, one honest moment found her. Just one, brief and complete, in which she understood exactly what she had done, and felt it without any softening. Then she closed the door on that feeling and went to bed, and did not open it again. Dominic heard the voicemail at 3 a.m. Singapore time and felt the floor disappear. He called Celeste immediately. She answered on the second ring, voice low, trembling at carefully chosen moments, explaining that the caretaker had vanished with the boys, that she had already called the police, that she did not understand how this could have happened, that she was devastated. Dominic listened to all of it. Then he said in a voice so quiet it was almost not a voice, "Do not leave that apartment. Call Emeka and tell him I said code red. I will be on the plane within the hour." He ended the call. He stood completely still for 4 seconds. Then he picked up his jacket and walked out of the boardroom without speaking to anyone in it and without looking back. Maricel did not go to the authorities at first light. Ben, she had already named them in her head, Ben and Bong, because they needed names, had developed a small fever in the night. Nothing dangerous, but enough to keep her sitting up beside him with a damp cloth until 4 a.m. By the time dawn came, she was too exhausted to leave, and by the time she had rested enough to think clearly, it was already afternoon, and they needed feeding again, and then it was tomorrow, and the decision had been postponed again without being fully made. That was how it started, not with a dramatic choice. With a fever and a damp cloth and the simple weight of being needed by something that could not be put down and walked away from without a cost, she was not certain she could pay. She went to the police station on the 3rd day, reported 2 babies found. The officer at the desk was managing 4 other things. He wrote something in a book and told her someone would follow up. No one followed up. She went back at 2 weeks. A different officer told her the case had been logged. She went a 3rd time and was redirected to the welfare office. The welfare office scheduled an assessment. The assessment was rescheduled twice. The system was not cruel. It was simply overwhelmed, understaffed, and full of people doing their best inside a structure that had far too many cases and far too few resources. But the result for Maricel, standing in a room with 2 growing babies and a rent that was already late, was the same as if the system had been cruel entirely. She named one Bong and one Ben because they could not go unnamed. She wrote the names on the inside cover of a crumpled notebook she found at the back of a drawer, and from that day forward she wrote everything in it. Every feeding, every temperature she assessed by pressing her cheek to their foreheads. Every small milestone, the first time Bong smiled a real smile, the first time Ben rolled himself over, the first fever and what she did about it, and when it broke and what she felt when it broke, written in smaller handwriting than the rest because it was the kind of thing you write small, even when you want to write it large. She measured their growth on the doorframe in blue pen every Sunday morning. Week 4, Week 8, Month 3. By the 4th morning, the neighborhood knew. Mama Rose arrived first, arms folded, voice already raised, performing for the crowd that had gathered conveniently at the gate. This woman cannot pay her own rent. She cannot feed herself. She has no husband, no plan, nothing, and she has gone and brought home 2 strange babies from the street. You are a laundry woman, Maricel, not a savior. Take those children to the authorities today. Maricel stepped into her doorway, 1 baby on each shoulder, and looked at Mama Rose without flinching. I have been to the authorities 3 times. I am waiting. Until the system moves, so they are safe with me. 3 times, and she is still standing here. Mama Rose turned to the crowd with a wide laugh. Somebody explain to this woman what the word no means. The crowd laughed with her. Someone at the back said something about women who could not have their own children. It landed precisely where it was aimed. Maricel's face did not move. She went inside and closed the door and sat down on the floor and breathed for 60 seconds. Then Bong started fussing. She got up and fed him. She did not have the luxury of falling apart. That was the thing no one watching from outside ever understood. Falling apart requires spare time. That same afternoon, Mr. Addo came, the landlord, a man who owned several buildings and dressed as though the number were much higher. He called Maricel into the courtyard in front of everyone. The rent I collect is for 1 occupant. If those babies remain here, it increases by 30% next month. That is not a discussion. Know your capacity, Maricel. Know who you are. He walked away. Not one person in that courtyard said a word in her defense. And that evening, Auntie Grace came, Maricel's own second cousin, church-going, Bible in hand, voice soft with the particular gentleness of someone who has decided they are the reasonable one. My dear, people are talking. Some are saying you gave birth to these babies yourself. I am not saying I believe it, but your reputation matters. You are buying formula on credit. You cannot sustain this. Take them to a proper facility. Not everyone is called to be a hero. Wisdom is knowing your limits. Maricel looked at her. Have you said everything you came to say? I say it in love. Then thank you for coming. Auntie Grace left. The door closed, and this time Maricel did not hold back. She sat on the floor between the 2 sleeping babies, and she cried. The way you cry when you are exhausted and humiliated and completely alone and still responsible for 2 lives that did not ask to be placed in your hands. She cried until there was nothing left. Then she washed her face, heated the formula, and fed them, because they were hungry, and she was the only one there. If Mama Rose, Mr. Addo, and Auntie Grace made your blood boil, you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe right now. Drop a love emoji in the comments, and keep watching, because justice is coming and it is worth every second of the wait. The weeks became months. Maricel learned things about herself she had not known before. She learned she could function on 4 hours of sleep for weeks at a time without it destroying her. She learned that real hunger, the kind that sits in your stomach from noon until the following morning, becomes background noise after enough days. Not acceptable, just background. She sold her mother's gold earrings in the 4th week, sold her good dress in the 3rd month, took on extra ironing before dawn, work done by candlelight because the electricity would trip past a certain hour and she could not afford the fine. Her hands, already rough, became something harder, the hands of someone who had been working without pause for a long time and had stopped noticing. She kept the notebook without fail, every feeding recorded, every milestone written down. She penciled growth marks on the doorframe every Sunday, and every Sunday felt something she had no clean word for, grief and pride and terror and love pressed together into one unnamed feeling that lived in her chest every time she put the pen away and looked at the new marks and looked at them and understood what they meant. Meanwhile, across the city in a different world, Dominic was coming apart in the quiet way powerful men come apart. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small details. The weight he was losing. The meetings he sat through without retaining anything. The way his mother had started lighting a candle every morning without saying why. He had hired 3 investigation firms. He had offered a reward that appeared on billboards and on national television. He had visited police divisions personally. He had called in every favor he had ever been owed, and found nothing because the search had been conducted in the wrong part of the city. Wealthy areas had reward posters on every street corner. The neighborhood where Maricel lived had received nothing. The police report she had filed 3 times, patiently, correctly, had been entered under the wrong case number by a junior officer and buried in the system. 2 worlds existed in the same city, and they did not know how to speak to each other, and his sons were in the gap between them. And Celeste stood beside him at every press conference. She cried perfectly. She held his arm. She had begun, with great care and apparent tenderness, suggesting that perhaps the boys had been taken out of the country. She was, millimeter by millimeter, steering his grief away from the truth. She was not sleeping well. That is worth noting. She had not slept well in months. Month 8 brought the worst day. Someone, Maricel had her certainty about who, though the report was anonymous, had filed a complaint with the Social Welfare Office, claiming she was exploiting 2 found infants for financial gain. She had never received a single coin from anyone for those boys. She had only ever spent. A welfare officer named Mrs. Bernard arrived with a clipboard. Mr. Addo came to observe. Mama Rose brought friends. A crowd formed at the gate, the same faces that had been watching and commenting for 8 months, and had never once offered to help. Mrs. Bernard entered the house. She looked at the drawer beds, the single bulb, the cracked walls. She began writing in her form with professional neutrality. Then she looked at the boys, round, bright-eyed, healthy, completely at ease. And she paused. She picked up the notebook. She read it. Not skimmed, read it, page by page in the quiet of that small room. When she reached the entry about the first fever, the temperature, the cloth, the hours Maricel had sat up, and then in smaller handwriting the words she had written when it broke, Mrs. Bernard stopped and read it twice. Maricel stood in the center of her home. I know what this room looks like. I have never pretended otherwise, but those boys have not missed a feeding in 8 months. Their development is on track. I have the clinic cards. I have kept every record. I am poor. I have been poor my entire life. But I have never confused poverty with neglect, and I am asking you not to either. The room was silent. Mrs. Bernard closed the notebook and placed it exactly where she had found it. Bong had reached out and taken Maricel's finger and was holding it with complete determination. Mrs. Bernard closed her clipboard. She left without removing the children. The crowd dissolved. Nobody apologized. Nobody came back later to check on Maricel or offer one word of acknowledgement that they had been part of something ugly. They simply moved on to the next thing and left her to clean up the remains of that day alone. That evening, Maricel sat on the floor between Bong and Ben, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. The humiliation of being assessed in her own home, the specific indignity of being found adequate, as though adequate were something to be grateful for, the exhaustion that had gone beyond physical into something she had no name for. She wanted, more than anything, to say out loud to someone, I am not all right. I am doing the right thing and I am not all right, and those 2 things are both true at the same time, and I do not know how to hold both of them. She had no one to say it to. Ben reached out in his sleep and closed his small fist around her finger. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote 2 words. Still here. Share this video right now with one person who needs to hear this story, and type Maricel in the comments. Let her know through this screen, across time, that someone was in her corner. 9 months after those babies disappeared, Dominic's personal assistant Bisi was in bed, past 11 at night, scrolling through a local community page on her phone. She was not looking for anything. She was simply scrolling the way people do when they are tired but not yet ready to sleep. She saw a post from a woman named Maricel, selling home-cooked food on weekends to raise money for 2 infant boys in her care. A photograph, 2 round, healthy, laughing boys in afternoon sunlight, matching printed shirts, sitting on a foam mat outside a small house. Bisi scrolled past. She went back. Something had caught without her knowing what. She zoomed in on the photograph and looked at it for a long time. The boy on the right had a dimple on his left cheek. Not an ordinary dimple, positioned slightly too high. A very specific and unusual placement. Bisi had seen that dimple in the entrance hall of Dominic's family home every day for 2 years. It was on the face of Dominic's late father in the large framed portrait. It was the kind of detail that passes through blood unchanged, the genetic equivalent of a signature. Her hands were not steady when she took the screenshot. She sent it to Dominic's personal number at 11:47 with the message, Sir, please look at this very carefully. I could be wrong. I am praying I am not wrong. His reply came in under 30 seconds. Who is this woman? Where does she live? Get me an address right now. It was a quiet Sunday morning, 7 o'clock. Maricel was at the clothesline, hanging the week's washing, listening to the street slowly wake up around her. The boys were still sleeping inside. She had checked on them twice already. 3 large black vehicles turned into her street. They moved with the kind of slow, deliberate certainty that told you before anything else was clear that something significant was happening. The neighborhood understood this immediately. Curtains shifted. A gate opened. Mama Rose appeared on her front step. Mr. Addo stepped out into his courtyard with his hands in his pockets. Auntie Grace, halfway down the street on her way to morning service, stopped walking and stood completely still. Dominic Reyes stepped out of the middle vehicle. He was not dressed the way people imagine billionaires dress. He wore plain clothes. No display, no performance. He looked like a man who had not truly rested in 9 months, which is exactly what he was, and who had only one thing on his mind and had been moving toward it since 11:47 the previous night, without stopping. In his right hand was the printed photograph from the community page. In his left, he carried the silk blanket with the Reyes family crest, recovered 2 nights earlier from Celeste's apartment after his security team finally pulled the gate surveillance footage from the Soule compound and found what had been there all along, waiting to be seen. He looked across the compound and saw Maricel at the clothesline. She saw him. She did not know who he was. She knew only what 9 months had taught her, that people with vehicles like those did not come to streets like hers to bring good news. She set the laundry down. She walked to her door and stood in front of it, the same way she had stood in front of it for Mrs. Bernard, the same way she had stood in front of it for Mama Rose. With the calm of someone who had been standing their ground for a very long time. "Good morning. Who are you and why have you come to my house?" He held up the photograph. Then the blanket. "My name is Dominic Reyes. I have been searching for my sons for 9 months. I believe they are in this house." Maricel's hands went completely still. A shirt fell from her fingers to the ground. She looked at the blanket. She had washed it every week for 9 months. It was almost transparent now, the gold embroidery of the crest still faintly visible, the cloth softened by water and time, and handling into something different from what it had been. She had never once thrown it away. She had not known why until this moment. She looked at his face, not at his vehicles or his clothes or the men standing behind him. At his face, see at the quality of stillness in it, the stillness of someone who has been holding himself together by force of will for 9 months and is now standing 2 meters from the thing he has been holding himself together for. She knew, without a test, without a document. She knew. She opened the door and stepped aside. Dominic walked into the smallest home he had ever entered. He stood in the doorway of the back room. 2 boys slept in drawer beds lined with soft cloth. He crouched down slowly and looked at their faces, his father's dimple, his late wife's nose, his own ears. And a sound came out of him that had no name in any language. He did not pick them up immediately. He placed one hand flat on the floor between them, bowed his head, and breathed. Outside, the whole street was watching. Mama Rose had not moved and had not spoken. Mr. Addo had removed his hat and was holding it in both hands. Auntie Grace's Bible was hanging at her side, open, unread. Not one of them said a single word. Within hours, the full truth had assembled itself. The surveillance footage from the Soule compound placed Celeste's vehicle at the gate at 12 minutes past midnight on the night the babies were left. The blanket confirmed the connection to the Reyes family directly. The security guard, who had been afraid and silent for 9 months, sat down with Dominic's legal team that afternoon and told them everything he had seen and everything he had stayed quiet about, and why. Celeste was not arrested dramatically. There was no scene. 2 officers arrived at the penthouse that morning. She was in her robe. She looked at them when they came through the door, and she did not speak for a moment. There was nothing left to arrange in her face. The performance was over, and what was underneath it was simply a woman who had made a decision 9 months ago that she could not take back, and had known every day since that she could not take it back. Dominic called her himself before the officers arrived. She answered immediately. Her voice had nothing rehearsed left in it. "Dominic, I want you to know that I told myself they would be found within the hour. I genuinely believed." "Celeste," she stopped. "There is no version of this conversation that changes what happened. My sons spent 9 months in a drawer because of a decision you made, and then sat beside me covering for 9 months while I was on television begging for information. There is nothing you can say to me. There is nothing I need to hear." He ended the call. He did not speak her name again. Not that day. Not ever. By midday, the neighborhood understood what it had done. The woman they had mocked and threatened and publicly assessed and tried to dismantle for 9 months had been sheltering the missing Reyes twins. The story that had been on national television for 9 months. The reward that had been on billboards. Maricel had walked past those billboards on her way to work and had never connected them to Bong and Ben. Because why would she? The people in those stories were always from a different world, and Bong and Ben were simply hers. Mama Rose said quietly to the woman standing beside her, "I did not know. How could anyone have known?" The woman beside her said nothing. Mr. Addo sent a representative to Maricel's door with an envelope later that day. He did not come himself. Maricel took the envelope, looked at it, and returned it unopened. "Tell Mr. Addo I do not need this." Auntie Grace called 3 times that week. Maricel answered on the 3rd call, and there was a silence before she spoke. "You told me to know my limits, Auntie. I thought about that a great deal. My limit turned out to be further than either of us knew. I'm glad I found out." She ended the call. Dominic sat across from Maricel in her small room, with his security outside and the street quieter than it had been all morning, and he asked her to tell him everything. She did. She began in the alley and she went through all of it. The arithmetic she had done crouching in the dark, the fever in week 1, the police station visits, the notebook, the welfare officer, the crowd at the gate, the dress she sold, the earrings, and the lunches she skipped, the nights she sat between 2 drawers instead of sleeping in her bed so she would hear them if they needed her. She talked for a long time. He did not interrupt once. He looked at the growth marks on the doorframe. He read the notebook the way Mrs. Bernard had, page by page, not skimming. He looked at his sons, awake now, watching Maricel from across the room with the calm recognition of children in the presence of their safe person. When she finished, there was silence. Then one of his lawyers, a careful, practical man who had been standing quietly near the door, leaned forward and began to say something about a formal arrangement, something transactional and legally structured and sensible, the kind of thing that makes perfect sense on paper and misses the point entirely. Dominic looked at him. "Give us the room." The lawyer left. Dominic looked at Maricel. "My sons do not know my voice yet. They know yours. I am aware that nothing I offer you is equal to what you gave, but I am going to try." He cleared every debt she had, rent arrears, shop credit, everything, within the same afternoon. A house was purchased in her name, a proper house in a safe part of the city, fully furnished, with a legal title deed that was hers alone and could not be touched by anyone without her direct consent. He established a laundry and garment business in her name. Real equipment, a commercial space, 8 employees, proper registration, and insisted she learn every aspect of running it before the business manager he hired for the first year stepped away because he was not interested in giving her something she could not control. He was interested in giving her something that would grow. He arranged for her to go back to school and complete the education she had abandoned at 17 when her mother became ill. He assigned her 2 lawyers whose only work was to ensure that everything, the house, the business, the income deposited monthly into an account only she controlled, was protected and permanent and structured so that no future circumstance could reach it. Then, after all of that, he said the thing that made her press both hands over her face. "Marco and Matteo will know your name before they know almost any other name. That is not a gift. That is simply what is true and what they deserve to know. They will know this notebook and this doorframe, and what you gave up and what it cost you and why you did it anyway. And when they are old enough to understand it fully, I want them to understand it from knowing you, because the lesson I most need them to learn is the one you have already lived." Maricel sat with her hands over her face for a while. When she lowered them, she looked at Marco and Matteo. She was going to have to learn those names, that was going to take time. And then she looked at Dominic. "I need to tell you something honestly. There were nights when I sat with the decision to let them go and I looked at it without flinching, and it was very close. I want you to know that. I am not a saint. I did not do this with certainty or ease. I just could not put them down. That is the whole of it. I could not put them down." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "That is exactly what it is to love someone." Before the final image, before the garden and the yellow dress and the boys running, there is one more moment that belongs in this story. Because the people who watched Maricel suffer for 9 months deserve a moment that looks them in the eye. 3 months after Dominic found his sons, the new business opened its doors on a commercial street 2 kilometers from where Maricel used to rent her single room. It was a proper space, clean signage, real equipment visible through the front window, 8 members of staff, and a name on the door in gold lettering. Maricel's name. Mama Rose walked past it on a Thursday afternoon on her way to the market. She stopped on the pavement in front of it. She stood there for a long time, reading the sign. Then she kept walking. She did not go in. She did not say anything to anyone about what she had seen, but that night people on the street noticed that Mama Rose's gate was closed earlier than usual, and that her light went off earlier than usual, and that she was, for the first time in anyone's memory, very quiet. The five Mateo are 2 years old. There is a birthday garden, real sunlight, balloons in a soft wind, the sound of celebration. 2 boys are running across the grass as fast as their legs will carry them toward a woman in a yellow dress who is already crouching down with her arms open wide, already reaching before they arrive. They are calling her name before they reach her, louder as the distance closes, certain and joyful and completely without hesitation, as if they have been calling it their entire lives. Because in every way that matters, they have. She catches them both. She holds them with her face pressed to the top of one small head and then the other. And over their shoulders, in the quiet inside the noise of the party, she can see in her memory the doorframe of her old room, the blue pen marks climbing steadily upward, week by week, month by month. And she understands, fully and finally, that those marks were never just a record of how much they had grown. They were a record of how far she had carried them, and she carried them all the way here. The woman they called a fool turned out to be the one holding everything together, and that is the story of Maricel. They laughed at her. They threatened her. They stood at her gate and told her she did not know her own limits. But she kept going, not because she was fearless. See, not because it was easy, not because she was certain it would end this way. She kept going because 2 small people needed her to, and she was the one who was there. If this story moved you, share it right now with someone who needs to hear it today. Like this video. Subscribe and ring that bell because there are more stories like this coming and you do not want to miss them. And leave a comment below. What part of this story stayed with you the longest? One last thing before you go. What would you have done that night in the alley? $47 to your name. A system that kept telling you to wait. 2 babies looking up at you in the rain. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.